But first, the threats are being ramped up over a vital oil shipping route, which Iran's threatening to block. The country says it's ready to confront any military ships crossing the security perimeter of its large-scale war games being held in neutral waters near the Hormuz Strait. Iran has already spotted a U.S. aircraft and other battleships in the region. Earlier, the Islamic Republic threatened to stop oil shipments through the channel if new Western-backed sanctions hit its fuel exports. Well, America is vowing to use its Navy stationed in the Persian Gulf to stop the Iranians from hindering passage. For analysis, we're now joined live by Robert Naiman, political director at the Just Foreign Policy think tank. Thanks for being with us this hour. A clear escalation of tension in the region. Is Iran at all concerned people will find the timing of its oil route threat more than coincidental at a time of large-scale naval maneuvers?
Well, I would guess the opposite, that the two are not occurring at the same time as a coincidence, but in fact that Iran is choosing this time to say this in order to underline its threat. And I think it's important to see that there is context for the Iranian government statements, namely, first of all, that it's understood in international political discourse and international law that an embargo is an act of war. And if it is really the policy pursued by the United States and Western Europe to try to cut off Iran's oil exports, then that is an act of war. And it would make sense for Iran to respond to that by saying, what they're going to do in response. And it wouldn't make sense for Iran just to roll over and say, sure, do whatever you want. We don't care. It also has to be pointed out that every day in the United States, I'm in Washington, every day U.S. government officials and people of influence are talking about U.S. and Israeli military strikes on Iran. Defense Secretary Panetta, most recently in a CBS interview, the February issue of Foreign Affairs has an article called Time to Attack Iran. So this is happening in a context of constant threats against Iran, unilateral threats, which of course violate the United Nations Charter, which forbids any UN member state from attacking another member state without the authorization of the UN Security Council. And of course, none of these voices are talking about getting UN Security Council approval for an attack in Iran because they know that they could never get it.
But doesn't Tehran risk being labeled as provocative here?
Sure, it risks being labeled as provocative, but again, you have to look at the context. If Iran doesn't make some response to the threats against it, then it risks being perceived as a country that can't defend itself. And in a way, that could be even more dangerous because there is a fantasy world that exists in Washington, in Tel Aviv, and some European capitals, in which Iran is a country that can't respond to U.S. threats. And that could be even more dangerous in terms of preparing the way for escalation in the future if people in the West don't understand that threats to attack Iran could come with a cost.
Obviously, confrontation in the Gulf could threaten world peace and peace in the region. How far do you see this ultimately escalating?
Well, that depends a lot on future developments. There's, you see in the U.S. presidential campaign, every Republican presidential candidate, except Ron Paul, who's now apparently leading in the Iowa caucuses, but every other candidate in these debates is calling for ramped up military escalation against Iran. The Obama administration is on the one hand, trying to discourage the military threats at the same time that it is escalating the economic threats. So those are dangerous developments which could escalate, particularly if one of the non-Ron Paul Republican candidates is elected next year, or even if the course of the Republican campaign becomes a kind of consensus of escalated threats. That itself, I think, could trigger a round of increasing escalation. And of course, both sides are engaging in a kind of brinkmanship. And we know from history that even when it might not be the intention of countries to go to war, they can miscalculate and think that, okay, I can escalate this threat and this won't go to war, but that may trigger a response from the other side that could lead to a spiral of confrontation. So I do think the situation is very dangerous, although I don't think right now either side really wants a military confrontation, because the consequences of that for all sides would be extremely deadly. And we saw that in the war with Iraq, what could be in store if there's a major military confrontation.
Right. Robert Naiman, political director at the Just Foreign Policy think tank. Thank you very much for your analysis.